Hi everyone, thank you for coming today. My name is Daniel Hooper and I'm a lecturer at Hakko University. Today I'm going to be talking to you about landscapes of practice and how self-access learning centers, and more specifically social learning spaces within self-access, fit within the landscape of practice of Japanese English education. So, first, social learning spaces. So these have become more popular over time as self-access reflects a growing recognition of the social elements of learner autonomy, as opposed to their previous iterations as places where people could come to access physical materials. So Garrell Murray describes a social learning space as a place where learners can gather to learn with and from each other through relaxed and informal social interaction. So learners can come together, they can talk in a casual setting using the target language as much as possible. So I want to look at social learning spaces through the theoretical framework of landscapes of practice. And this is a kind of updated iteration of a very famous theory that I'm sure most of you will know, which is communities of practice. Now, but communities of practice were, the theory was criticized for a number of reasons. One of the reasons being that it didn't really take into account the context in which a particular community is nested. It kind of, according to some researchers, kind of saw communities as or portrayed communities as existing within a kind of vacuum. So not really taking into account institutional or sociocultural factors on the community's practice. Another criticism which has been leveled against communities of practice is the tendency to ignore the individual or underrepresent the individual. In the earlier iterations of communities of practice, they tended to portray communities of practice members as kind of homogeneous, so just club members, rather than, you know, nuanced and complex individuals bringing their own pasts and futures with them into the community. So landscapes of practice kind of was created in response to lots of the criticism that communities of practice received, and focuses more on the individual as they travel through a landscape of multiple communities of practice and shape their own individual sense of knowledgeability. Okay. So, Pyrko, Dörfler and Eden describe a landscape of practice as a geography of local practices. So, for me, I saw this as an interesting parallel with Phil Benson's 2017 article, where he kind of described self-access as not being a replacement for the classroom or, you know, an alternative to the classroom, but instead it was one site within a kind of a broader landscape of learning settings where learners could use their agency and, you know, develop competence through a number of settings, one of which is the classroom, one of which is self-access. So I saw this as kind of an interesting and a useful parallel when talking about self-access. Self-access is one of these communities, one of these peaks within our learners' lifelong learning paths, trajectories. So another way of looking at this is an interplay between the social and the individual. So by this, what I mean is first of all, looking at the social. Some communities will welcome us. They will allow us to join easily. They will give us access to the knowledge that they construct. And yeah, we will be able to progress within the community until, well, if we desire it, central membership. Other communities, however, will have maybe gatekeeping practices, which will keep certain types of people, perhaps, or certain types of knowledge at their borders. They will not allow them access. So, for example, if I went to a conference of quantitative researchers, they might not recognize my knowledgeability as a qualitative researcher, for example. Okay. Other communities might have a very steep learning curve, and it might take intense emotional and time investment in order to gain access to the community's knowledge and progress within the community. On the other hand, we have the individual. So, as an individual, she may not desire access to this community. She may walk around it. She may ignore it. Or she may be compelled to participate in a certain community, but begrudgingly do so. Just do enough to fulfill expectations and nothing more. They do not internalize it as part of their identity. On the other hand, some communities learners might deeply desire to enter, but they are barred from. So you can see we have a kind of interplay of structure and agency, of social and individual, access and power. Oh, sorry, beg your pardon. So, looking at our landscape of practice in Japan, in terms of English education, one of the key concepts in my study was it as a divided field. And by divided, I mean ideologically. So the first half, or the first side, is what people refer to as eigo. Now, eigo is generally focused upon developing declarative grammatical knowledge, often for the purposes of passing standardized examinations, entrance examinations. So it's often taught in the learner's L1. So in our case, Japanese, and there's also kind of a ethnic or racial component to it, in that eigo is, due to the necessity for L1 proficiency, often taught by Japanese instructors. On the other hand, Eikaiwa is a very, very different ideology. So it prioritizes communicative competence in English and doesn't really focus on explicit or discrete grammatical knowledge per se, but rather focuses on communicative competence, and therefore tends to rely on more like Western-centric methodologies, such as task-based language teaching or communicative language teaching. Also, it tends to be taught in the L2 only, English only format, and by non-Japanese instructors. And this kind of ideological divide is something that we see in secondary, tertiary, and private education sectors throughout Japan. There's a lot of research on this. Diane Holly Nagatomo has written a lot of great material on this. So what I see is students often moving between secondary education, which is highly geared towards eigo, the development of eigo-oriented knowledge, discrete grammatical knowledge for passing tests, and what they experience often in university English, and particularly self-access, which is Eikaiwa. So Eikaiwa, where we have a completely different sense of legitimate knowledge. So And how eigo can translate into Eikaiwa is not always very smooth. So what this can do is cause what Zitoun, a researcher who looks at life transitions, what Zitoun calls rupture. Now, rupture is a sense of kind of displacement or unease or conflict that individuals experience when they transition between two different spheres of experience, or in this case, spheres of knowledge, eigo and Eikaiwa. So what I could see just anecdotally is a lot of students would come into university and they would be back to square one, because the knowledge that they had cultivated for passing tests in high school or junior high school, and again, legitimate knowledge, but it was not recognized within their new sphere of experience. So, for example, a social learning space where English-only policies were in place and proficient English speakers were commonplace. So this is a big issue. So my study, based on these factors, kind of looked at two learners and their experiences as they traveled across a landscape of practice. It was based on a larger ethnographic study, a longitudinal study that took place over roughly 2 years, where we looked at the community of a social learning space within a university self-access center. And in this study, I focused on two of the participants, Mei and Kaide. Now, Mei and Kaide were both sophomore students who were majoring at Spanish at the time of the study, but both had a very strong international mindset, as Yashima described. So, really, really interested in foreign things, foreign news, wanted to live overseas, wanted to travel overseas, make foreign friends. So they were both similar in these senses. However, personality-wise, they're very different. Mei was very kind of strong-willed. She had very, very strong opinions, scathing opinions about certain things, and seemed more confident overall. Kaide, on the other hand, was far more reserved and had a lot of issues over self-confidence with both English proficiency and just social interaction. So, in Mei's case, Mei kind of displayed a lot of unaligned engagement in junior high and high school, or to the eigo ideology. So, unaligned engagement is kind of towing the line. So, she was participating on a surface level to satisfy requirements of her, but she kind of had resistance, or she did not invest herself in this style of study. This is linked to what she described as jitsuose. Now, jitsuose is kind of practicality. And she saw the highly eigo-focused practice of the social learning space as being very practical. She would often say practical, practical. And she would position this in opposition to her experiences in secondary education. Eigo. She would constantly, she would often talk about eigo as being like a waste of time. Like very, very negative framing of her eigo classes. And would also, again, talk very favorably about how practical and useful the social learning space was. This was also tied to a sense of akogare, or longing, towards foreign or international things, which she told me had existed since she was maybe even in elementary school or even before. Her mother had fostered a kind of a love of international things, and this had influenced Mei very strongly. She also kind of saw international things, and by extension the social learning space, as kind of a place for escapism, where she could escape kind of what she called the reality, the dull reality of Japan. However, she also, in her transition into this community, experienced some rupture. she said she felt very, very anxious when she first came into the community and almost walked away from it, despite her motivation. And over time, she also built a sense of identity in relation to that community, the social learning space community. She said she felt a sense of duty to kind of help socialize future generations of freshmen who want to use that community as well. So she became very, emotionally invested in the social learning space. Kaide, on the other hand, had a very different trajectory across the landscape. So in the past, she had a very negative experience in junior high and high school, and kind of framed herself in very deficit terms as a eigo ga dekinai hito, so someone who can't do English. And she said this was reinforced by the test-taking practices and her lack of perceived competence in those practices within an eigo-oriented environment. Conversely, when she started participating in the social learning space, she said she felt an identity as eigo ga shabereru kaede, kaede who can speak English. So you can see this dramatic change occurred, where she felt a sense of kind of possibility for competence, possibility for creating a desired identity. However, the gap between eigo and Eikaiwa was considerable. So she would see these students in the social learning spaces being like very fluent speakers, and she said she felt she was kind of meiwaku, kind of a bother to them, because her English proficiency was not high enough. So she kind of saw herself as being in between. I kind of term this as liminal. Liminal means in between. You're not A, you're not B. So she kind of turned away from eigo, but then again, like, Eikaiwa was also unattainable for her in terms of her self-perception. And this caused kind of, I feel like, emotional labor for her. However, she eventually came to kind of reconcile this sense of liminality. She went study abroad to Spain, and while she was there, in the morning she would study kind of in a more eigo-oriented way, so using textbooks, studying vocabulary lists. But then in the afternoon she would go out and try and use these words in a more Eikaiwa-centric way. So she was kind of eigo in the morning, Eikaiwa in the afternoon. And she said she found this really, really empowering and useful. And what she did is she took this experience and brought it back to the social learning space. And in this way, she was able to kind of reconcile the knowledge ability that she had developed as a secondary school student with the knowledge she was developing in the social learning space. She was able to create her own sense of knowledgeability, rather than looking at Eikaiwa good, eigo bad, or vice versa. So, one important point which I kind of took from this study was that when we're looking at learners or, students in self-access, we're dealing with liminal or textile identities. Learners might be in between communities. They might be on the border of different communities as they gradually come to adjust. So students coming from secondary education into higher education and self-access might require support in adjusting to this new sense of legitimate knowledge, new concept of legitimate knowledge. The eigo which they were trained in might not be immediately applicable. So this, from SALC staff or learning advisors or peers, we might need to support students as they develop. Also, it shows the value of a self-access center and also social learning space as a venue for trying on a new identity or trying on new selves. So, for example, in Kaide's case, she was able to try on a new identity in which she felt competent, opposed to the sense of deficit she felt when she was in secondary school. And then gradually this identity developed further into a textile, a kind of in-between identity, which she found really, really useful for her. So giving students autonomy, but also support and allowing them to kind of construct their own identity. Also, well, I kind of alluded to it before, but also the importance of social resources. In Zitoun's work on rupture, she stated that social resources are really important for helping learners to adjust to rupture. And we could do this by creating kind of easy ways into social learning spaces, rather than just expecting students to jump into a new sphere of experience, a new place where like everyone has different knowledge to them. We need to be aware and create maybe ways for beginner students to kind of enter the community and participate perhaps on a peripheral level at first, but then gradually increase. Also, the value of near-peer role models. Students who are similar to the beginner students, but slightly higher in proficiency, so this can kind of scaffold their entry and also motivate them as well, offering versions of possible future selves. Finally, I hope that this study can also add to the literature that kind of argues for a move away from like dichotomous black and white thinking within Japanese EOT. Rather than seeing Eikaiwa as superior to Eigo or vice versa, seeing them as just different ideologies or different communities within a landscape from which students can take value from both, or take value from many different sites to create their own individual sense of knowledgeability across the entire landscape. Okay, so that's my references. And thank you everyone for listening. If anyone has any questions after, please ask me. Sorry, I had to squeeze a lot into a short time, but yeah, I'm looking forward to hearing from you. Thank you.